Hello everyone, welcome to another lecture video. Today we're going to be talking about the short story A White Heron by Sarah Orne Jewett. Very interesting story, as I hope you all have noticed with reading it. Where to start? In many ways, this is a story of opposites. We see that all throughout the text, these different pairs of things that are completely different. We have country and city. We have youth and maturity. We have nature and science. We have love and money. And we ultimately have male and female. And what the author is doing throughout this story appears to be taking these concepts and linking them to the two central characters in the text. The first central character, of course, is Sylvia. She is the protagonist, the main character of this story. And she is, from nearly the beginning of this story, linked with nature. The author tells us on page 203 in your textbook that everybody said that it was a good change for a little maid who had tried to grow for 8 years in a crowded manufacturing town. But as for Sylvia herself, it seemed as if she never had been alive at all before she came to live on the farm, or at the farm. She grew up at the beginning of her life in a crowded industrial city, a city that was a manufacturing city, which meant it was all about technology, progress, making things, factories, that sort of thing. And she couldn't thrive in that environment. It was not until her grandmother took her to the forest in Maine that she is able to fully thrive, to fully be human inside of not the city, but the country out in the forest, in the woods. Interestingly, she also has a very specific connection with the animals in the woods. They consider her one of their own, as I think the grandmother says. She has a special connection with the animals. There's some sort of bond between them where the animals don't recognize her as being like the other humans, being separate and distinct from them. And finally, jumping ahead a tiny bit, when we get to that climax, the oak, you'll notice, is alive and apparently has a mind of its own. And it is specifically stated, or the author specifically states, that the oak loves Sylvia, loves this little thing coming up on top of it. The tree seemed to lengthen itself out as she went up and to reach farther and farther upward. This is on page 209. It was like a great mainmast to the voyaging earth. It must truly have been amazed that morning through all its ponderous fame as it felt this determined spark of human spirit wending its way from higher branch to branch. Who knows how steadily the least twigs held themselves to advantage this light, weak creature on her way. The old pine must have loved his new dependent. So she has this very, very strong connection to nature and the natural world, both the animals in that world and even the things we wouldn't normally think of as being thinking, having a mind or a will, like the tree, which apparently does in this story. That's Sylvia. On the other side of the equation, we have the young man, the hunter, who comes into the forest searching for this elusive white heron. And he is, in almost every way conceivable, the opposite of Sylvia. He is a visitor to the woods. She lives there in the woods, in the farmhouse with her grandmother. He's a visitor. He's on vacation. Where does he live? He lives in the city. We're not told what he does exactly in the city, but that's where he works. That's where he lives. He's on vacation in the woods. He's also associated with technology through his use of a gun, which is again, technology we take for granted today, but even in that time wasn't that new. It had been around for only probably about 100 some odd years at that point, maybe 150, something like that. And as we all kind of know, a gun gives you an advantage in hunting. It makes it a lot easier than having to hunt something down with sticks and stones, even bows and arrows and knives and things like that. A gun makes hunting much, much easier. It's a technological breakthrough that has given people a huge advantage over the natural world. And he represents, in the fact that he comes from the city and also the fact that he has this gun with him at all times, the wonders of technology, of advancements in human resources and how humans go about trying to conquer the natural world. He also is different in his relationship to the animals in the woods. Whereas Sylvia seems to be almost one of the animals in the woods, the hunter is very distinct from them. He sees them as objects of study, not as friends. I'm thinking here particularly of the birds, where he seems to love birds. He knows a lot about them. He's spending his whole vacation looking at birds, hunting for birds, all that sort of thing. But he doesn't really love them in the sense of the way Sylvia does, loves them as living creatures, wants what's best for them. He is interested in them as objects of scientific study. That's why he kills them and stuffs them, as opposed to valuing their continued existence. This puts him more in line with science than it does nature. He's interested in learning about birds. He's not interested in actually caring about individual birds. He doesn't value their lives. He values learning more about them, hence why he's willing to kill them and stuff them so that he can learn more about them scientifically. And this is I dare say, fairly accurate representation of the core of biological science for many folks throughout this time period. Dissections were starting to become more popular, or at least continuing their popularity that they'd had since the Victorian time. Dissecting animals so as to learn more about how they work, their inner organ functions, and all that sort of thing. But also, it wouldn't be too long after this story that a technique called, I think, dissections came to be very popular and also controversial among scientists, where scientists would actually dissect an animal that was still alive in order to see how its organs were actually functioning while it was still alive. Many scientists felt that this was necessary in order to learn more about how that animal functions, how its bodily fluids, organs, particularly all those things work. But there were other people who were vehemently against this practice and said it was morally wrong because it was inflicting so much pain on a living being. But I digress. What the main point I'm trying to get across here is that the man represents the city, he represents technology, and he represents science. Whereas Sylvia represents the country, she represents simple living, and she represents nature. And very interestingly, though they are exact opposites, they still attract. Sylvia has a crush on the young hunter, right? The narrator tells us on page 207, she had never seen anybody so charming and delightful. The woman's heart, asleep in the child, was vaguely thrilled by a dream of love. Some premonition of that great power stirred and swayed these young creatures who traversed the solemn woodlands with soft-footed, silent care. So she's got a crush, perhaps her first crush ever. And remember, she's a young girl, probably in the range of like 12 to 13, would probably be pushing it. She's a young girl. We don't know how old the guy is, but the fact that the word boy is still applied to him probably means he's a young guy, probably not older than his mid-20s or so, but still a obvious age gap, which once again is another difference between them. He represents maturity. He knows a lot. He knows more about birds than Sylvia does, even though she lives among them. He knows about the world. He knows about the city. He knows about technology. He knows all of these things, and he has maturity to him that Sylvia, being young, is naive. Many things she doesn't know. And so you have those tensions between them. We also see that he has some other fundamental differences. Like we've already talked about, he kills birds while Sylvia befriends them. And this is not necessarily the most definite sign of being a heinous, evil person. But there are some red flags we start to see. That's the first one, and we see more and more of them for this guy. He's ultimately selfish, not in the sense that he's a narcissist or something like that, but through the course of this story, he is concerned with himself, his own needs, desires, wants. He wants that white heron. That's why he's in this part of the woods. That's why he's hanging out with Sylvia. It's not because he really cares about her as a person. He's interested in hopefully convincing her to help him find this white heron. He is always concerned about his own wants in the course of this story. Whereas Sylvia is almost totally selfless. She wants to please him. She's doing things to gain his affection, his approval. She's following him around in the woods and listening to what he says. She's having a crush on him. She wants to find the white heron for him. Her desire to do what he wants drives her to come up with this plan to go to the oak at the climax. She wants to please him, and he wants to be pleased. And therefore, we have, once again, these tensions, these opposites. And yet, they still come together because Sylvia is still very interested in him, even though he's so different from her. He's still charming, and it's possibly because of his differences that he is so interesting to her. All of these themes come together in the climax of the story, where not only do the characters have their resolution, but also we get to see what the author really thinks about the things they represent and how they are clashing or coming together. Interestingly, her desire to please him is what leads again to the climax. It's because of her desire to show him what he wants, that white heron, that she goes to the tree. I forgot one element, though, that I need to take a step back and talk about. He also has another thing she doesn't have: money, right? She and her grandmother are poor. They're out there, simple country folks. He's a city slicker who's got money, and it's no big deal to him to pay $10 to find out the location of this white heron. $10 at this time period in the country was not a small amount of money. That was the amount of money that would significantly help her and her grandmother. And so that dimension is also going on too. He not only has the maturity and the technology and the knowledge, but he also has money that she lacks. Now, back to the climax. Her desire for him, for all these things, well, he can give her, pleasing him, all that sort of stuff, is what drives her to come up with this plan, to climb this tall oak tree, right? And at the top of it, to look out. And she knows if she does that early in the morning, she'll see where that white heron flies from and know where its nest is. And she does it, right? She climbs up the tree through great difficulty at first, which is interesting. The specific difficulties she has are from the things that she is connected to. The animals don't see her like one of their own anymore, which at least one scholar has pointed out in the literature about this piece. The squirrel treats her like a housebreaker, like a thief coming through the oak. And at first, it says, the way was harder than she thought. She must reach far and hold fast. The sharp, dry twigs caught and held her and scratched her like angry talons. She's being prevented almost by the tree from reaching her goal of selling out this bird. But ultimately, we're told the oak also loves her and helps her get to the top. And when she's at the top, she has that beautiful moment where she sees the beauty of nature in a way she's never been able to see it before. She has almost this experience of being one with the natural world. And she sees the heron as he comes out, and he perches right next to her. And they're there together as the morning is coming. And it's a beautiful moment that she has. And then she comes down. And she's got the knowledge that she wanted to have. She has gained what she needed to do to please this hunter. And she fully intends to tell him where the white heron is. But then at that moment when she's about to tell him, she can't. Because she knows what will happen to that heron. She knows that this heron will be shot, he'll be gutted, and he'll be stuffed. And be a part of this hunter's collection. And after having spent that morning with that beautiful bird, where there was this trust, it seems, between the two of them, where they shared this morning together, she knows that she would be betraying him if she did that. And she can't bring herself to do that. She can't bring herself to sell out the life of this heron, even for $10 and the approval of this hunter. And so the hunter leaves disappointed, and Sylvia is hurt. But the last bit of the story tells us that she doesn't stay hurt for too long. Dear loyalty that suffered a sharp pang as the guest went away disappointed later in the day, that could have served and followed him and loved him as a dog loves. Many a night Sylvia heard the echoes of his whistle haunting the pasture path as she came home with the loitering cow. She forgot even her sorrow at the sharp report of his gun and the sight of thrushes and sparrows dropping silent to the ground, their songs hushed and their pretty feathers stained and wet with blood. So, what's going on here? Ultimately, Sylvia finds that her personal connection with nature is too strong to betray. Because if she betrayed that white heron, she would be betraying a friend. She would be betraying her values, the fact that she values the lives of these animals. She'd be betraying it. She'd be betraying who she ultimately is. And so she won't do it. And she pays a price for that, and that whatever love she had for this hunter will never be fulfilled. And they go their separate ways. It's worth pointing out here that in some ways, you could see this story as almost like a light fairy tale. Theodore R. Halbett is a scholar who makes this argument in an essay you can look up if you want to. Her climbing the tree is, in many ways, especially with personifying the tree as a character, a lot like venturing into the other world that we saw in the fairy tales that we studied earlier in this unit. And then when she's up there, the wonder and beauty of the world seen from the top of the trees is in many ways like a fairy world. And like all those fairy tales, she gains something in that other world that she brings back with her down to her own world and changes how she acts in her own world. In this case, it was the knowledge of where the heron is, but also this connection she feels more strongly with that heron and with nature as a whole that affects what she ultimately does with the hunter. So, what about the themes? What's interesting about this story is that it is one of the first stories that I'm aware of that connects feminism with environmentalism. The narrator, it seems pretty frank, is not for the hunter. He is ultimately a bad guy. Why is he bad? Because he represents the industrial complex that's developing in America at that time that would not recognize humans' connection to the natural world and instead would see the natural world as something to be studied and something to be used, as opposed to something to be respected and something that one cares for as a human being. And so he also very much represents, I think, the author's overall view of men in her time period, which, again, frankly, is not super positive, right? The author never got married. She remained single throughout her whole life. She, in many ways, is like Sylvia. She grew up in this same area of Maine. She had a lot of interaction with the country. And she ultimately decided never to get married. And she thought that in order for her to really be an author and really be true to her own self, she needed to remain single for her whole life. And she doesn't seem to have really had any regrets about that. So Sylvia and the author are in many ways very similar. And so Sylvia's rejection of the hunter seems to be a choice that the author approves of, that it's good for Sylvia to reject that kind of guy, because the only real love they could ever have would be her loving him like a dog loves, like a dog who just only is concerned with the other person and doesn't care if that other person mistreats them or doesn't have their best interests at heart. That's the more feminist angle of it. The idea that women don't need men, especially they don't need men who are going to be more concerned with themselves, their own desires, wants, needs, rather than caring about the woman inside of a relationship. The environmental side, which she again connects because she seems to be saying that there's a connection between the feminine and the natural world. Since the hunter is associated with the city and technology and science and all that kind of stuff, that seems to be the purview of men in this short story, as it by and large was at the time the story was written. Whereas the women are the ones who remember nature, who care about nature, who care about animals and are connected to the natural world. And so, not only is this story ultimately saying that the rejection of the hunter and love in a romantic sense towards him was a good thing on Sylvia's part. If she had to lose that to save the bird, then that's what needed to happen. But also a rejection of those other things that the hunter represents: industry, technology, science that's based on breaking things in order to figure out how they work, as Tolkien also critiqued in The Lord of the Rings. She's saying that Sylvia did well to choose the life of that bird and the life of all living creatures, to value them, that is good and that is worthwhile because all life is sacred. And to paraphrase Tolkien, if you kill an animal, if you end a life to figure out more about that life, then you have stepped off the path of wisdom. You have become just obsessed with knowledge. And that ultimately, I think, is what the story is about. She is attempting to tell us, women in particular, not me in that case, but for you ladies, I think she's trying to tell you that you don't need to settle for a man who is going to be self-centered. You don't need to settle for puppy love. You can hold out either for somebody who is going to respect you and love you, or if that person never comes along, that's okay. It's going to be painful, but there are other things that are as meaningful as romantic love, such as Sylvia's connection with nature. On the other hand, it's also telling all of us readers that we need to be careful and we need to have some suspicions about us to this industrial world, a world obsessed with science and technology and progress and doesn't really care about the environment or what it does to animals in order to gain more knowledge or power. Well, I hope that you all enjoyed this short story, and I will see you in a future lecture. God bless you and have a great day.